to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and I am joined by my co-host Lee Johnson and our extra special new co-host for this season, David Gunkel. Today we are talking about originality again. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and get people's drinks going and find out if you're ranting or raving. Lee, let me start with you. What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I am going to have a amaretto sour, feeling like something sweet. And today I am raving about reality TV cooking competition shows. I have to say, I don't really still understand how these work, but they do work. I know that people say we eat with our eyes, but it does seem like cooking would be sort of the worst thing to watch a competition show about, but there are so many good ones, and I'm positive when I watch these shows, like who should win, whatever the competition is, despite the fact that I never put a morsel of food in my mouth. So it's become its own entire pop culture, subculture with its own personalities and celebrities, but I really do love these shows, and I think it's just amazing that these things even work.
David, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
So it's nice and sunny in Chicago today, and it's sort of warmish. So I'm thinking of Kolsch. And if I want a Kolsch, I want to do a Kolsch from Hinterland in Green Bay, Wisconsin, because they do a good version.
Nice.
And I guess I want to rave today. And I'd like to rave about our students. We are at the end of the semester, and we're about to graduate and put into the world the fresh set of graduates ready to take on the challenges and the opportunities of the 21st century.
Fully brainwashed.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I am really impressed with this round of students that I'm looking at for this year. I'm actually in the midst of marking their final projects, and the stuff they have produced is absolutely incredible. I'm really optimistic about this generation and the way that they are going to respond to a lot of the big challenges that for me would have seemed absolutely insurmountable when I was their age. So I'm very proud of them, and I'm very optimistic about their future.
Hear, hear.
Cosign. Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting and raving about?
I'm going to dovetail on David's recommendation of a Kolsch, but I'm going to have a Dovetail Kolsch. It's a local brewery here, so Dovetail, please call us. Today I am ranting, but I have a rave within my rant. And I am ranting about Eric Hovde, I think his name is, the Republican candidate for Senate in Wisconsin. So Eric Hovde is an idiot of epic proportions. But beyond that, it turns out that he lives in Orange County, California.
What?
Yeah. So just a year ago, he was named one of the 500 most influential businessmen in Orange County, California. And so he's, of course, running for Senate in Wisconsin. My rave within this rant is Rachel Maddow, who brought this to my attention on a recent episode of The Rachel Maddow Show in the fashion that only Rachel can bring to this.
It's so weird. It feels like that should be not allowed. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I'm going to run for president of Germany. So, Lee, I know we're talking about originality, but what did you have in mind?
So originality is a notion that really does resonate across a lot of different domains, from art and literature to science and technology, and it embodies the idea of creating something new, something that stands apart from what has come before. But what really does it truly mean to be original? At its core, originality challenges us to break free from the constraints of convention and tradition, to forge new paths and explore uncharted territories. And it invites us to think differently, to question norms, and to push beyond the boundaries of our imaginations. But the quest for originality is not without its problems. In a world saturated with information and ideas, where every corner of the globe is interconnected, aren't we really just remixing and repackaging existing concepts in an endless cycle of iteration? And especially now in the age of generative AI, there are whole new questions that are being raised about authenticity and influence. How much of our creativity is ever truly our own, and how much of it is influenced by the world around us? Can we ever truly claim ownership over an idea, or are we all just simply standing on the shoulders of giants? So as we navigate this discussion today, I want us to explore this tension between innovation and tradition, between individual expression and collective influence. Is there anything new under the sun? Or is it the case, as Voltaire suggested, that originality is nothing other than judicious imitation?
Yeah, I've heard all that before.
ChatGPT helped me write that intro. As you know, my favorite thing is to start with a definitional question. So I do want to start with what originality means to us, to each of us individually, before we start talking about what the value of originality is or isn't. So what does originality mean to you guys when it comes to, let's say, ideas? But you can also talk about texts, art, music, comedy, any other iteration of human expressivity.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, David. I was going to copy what you said, so.
Original answers only, please.
Well, okay, so I like to think about this by getting very literal about it. Where does originality originally originate?
Nice.
And within the Western philosophical tradition, originality really originates in Plato, the Republic, or the Phaedrus, both of which are about originality with regards to the written word as being a derivation of an original spoken performance. In fact, this is one of my favorite stories in Plato. The Phaedrus begins with a book, and it ends with a meditation on writing as a derived product of an original spoken performance. So the great thing about the Phaedrus is that it opens with a book, and it's one of the best jokes in graduate seminars is Socrates says, "Hey, Phaedrus, is that a book I see on your cloak? Or are you just happy to see me?"
Yeah.
Right? But this idea that the spoken performance that the Phaedrus refers to happens outside the dialogue.
Right.
It's not actually accounted for in the dialogue, which means originality is always this kind of deferred difference. It's always indifference, right? It always is absent, and it is always away from the engagement with the reproduction that you have, in this case, with the written word.
Yeah.
You have something very similar in the Republic, where we try to banish the imitative artists because they create imitations of the real, of the original, of the eidos. And as a result, you have to have a crackdown on the deception of the images and be able to do that kind of political intervention to try to return us to the origin of originality. So I think there's already a lot in Plato that problematizes this very notion, this very idea of the original as even being original, that originality itself may originally be derived.
Yeah. So it's hard to follow someone who says there is no such thing. I think when I use originality, and for me, this is a really interesting topic because I'm a historian of philosophy. And so I'm someone who actually thinks there is nothing original, particularly in philosophy. But I do think that there are original combinations of elements that have already been produced. I think of, for example, within comedy, there could be someone who takes, perhaps a joke that is the same as one we've heard before or has the same structure, but delivers it in a different context or with a different medium or something like that. And it's the combination of those two things that produces something different. I don't know about original, but I think there's something about combining elements that is part of what I would consider to be original.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I don't think that there are original productions, human productions that are ex nihilo, right? That are new in that sense. But I do think that there's something about the stamp that the producer puts on a product, on his or her product, that does make it original. That particular mixing of one's thought or labor or whatever with the materials of the world or with history and traditions that makes it original to that person. But again, that's not, I don't think, really what we mean when we say original.
This is the argument that Deleuze makes in Difference and Repetition. This idea of repeating something to the extent where you extract out of it the difference that makes the difference. That it's not difference versus repetition, it's difference in repetition.
Yeah, no, that I completely agree with. So why is it that do you think we put so much value on originality?
Well, it has to do with a very long-standing Western philosophical tradition of our axiology. There's a value that we place on the original, the authentic. If you doubt this, just say to one of your friends, let's go to Taco Bell. It's so inauthentic. It's so unoriginal, right? The unoriginal, the inauthentic is always considered bad, whereas the original is considered good. This is one of these classic binary oppositions that organizes Western metaphysics. And as a result of it, we have from Plato through Walter Benjamin and beyond, this idea of the original as somehow being worthy of protection, whether that be in moral terms or in legal terms. This idea of banishing the imitative artists already in Plato. It's all an attempt to try to protect this notion of the original that we already vest great value in. So this is why I think somebody like Nietzsche is incredibly disruptive, because he wants to invert Platonism and say, I'm going to take the appearance, the copy, as the most valuable thing and break with this tradition. And that seems very disruptive to us because it completely inverts the axiology we've inherited.
Right.
So, David, for my brother-in-law, Dave, could you say what axiology is?
Yeah, axiology is just the theory of value, both aesthetic value and also moral value. And when we talk about original, we are talking mainly in aesthetic terms, but there's also a moral component to it. Think about, laws of intellectual property and copyright. They are to protect the moral status of the work and the moral right of the author. So axiology is about both sets of values, whether it be the values we have in aesthetics, art, or in ethics and morality.
But there, I think you get to one of the important points, namely that it seems like our emphasis on originality has something to do with our insistence that we are radically free individual agents, and therefore whatever we do or whatever we make is sort of like an upsurge of radically originary creativity.
Yeah, there's also a kind of fickleness to the way that we apply this axiology as well, because there are certain things we value more the emphasis on originality than other things. I mean, just to pick very common examples, everybody's fine with cover bands, right? Like, as a matter of fact, I'm a big fan of cover bands. Right? It seems like something that is fine to do, but nobody is fine with, cheating or what seems like cheating. No, but, now we're in an entirely different, complicated era of this problem with cultural appropriation. We're all rightfully offended at cultural appropriation, despite the fact that all of us are cultural appropriators in one way or another.
There's an interesting example we have of this about covers, right? About the reproduction of something original. And you could argue in some cases, cover versions are more original than the original they cover. You think, for example, of Devo's version of Satisfaction, which completely upends the Rolling Stones rock and roll version of it and creates something entirely innovative that many people prefer to the so-called original version. But I think the best example of this is a little story from Borges. So Borges has one of these fictional book reviews that he writes of a book by Pierre Menard, who writes the Quixote. So Menard basically copies verbatim the entirety of Cervantes' novel. And Borges argues that this is more original than the original Quixote, because Menard is able to produce something that speaks to its time in a way that the original Quixote doesn't. And so completely messes with our notion of what is the original, what is the copy, and how we apply the word originality not as a metaphysical, ontological statement, but rather as a value statement, as a way of valuing something or marking its importance.
I
mean, in this sense, and this is the second time, David, you've broached this issue, that originality as a value might emerge from the fact that in certain copies, we see something that we didn't see in the original. And so in that sense, it might as well not have been there. The repetition, as you put it earlier, so now I'm thinking about cover bands and the Devo cover of Satisfaction. it shows something about satisfaction that we didn't see in the Stones version of it. And therefore, this opening our eyes or opening our understanding or opening our ears is linked then, or we link it to a certain kind of originality.
I think there's also a social evolutionary point that's probably worth making here, which is that it is important to societies and communities to value things like, to use today's parlance, innovation. Right? Societies thrive when we value originality in these forms, creativity, innovation, etc.
I would agree, except for when the valuing of originality produces a legal framework that suppresses innovation. Right. So copyright and intellectual property law is meant to protect innovation, but in many cases it stifles innovation by restricting what you can do. So the extension of the recent copyright protections, the life of the author plus 75 years, makes it almost impossible for any contemporary innovator to borrow from his or her own time and remix ideas from another inventor or creator to create something new. We are only now beginning to be able to use things from the 1920s, right? Yeah. This is amazing. Yeah. We can finally remix things from early 20th century. And so I think the balance that is needed to be struck here is very complicated, because on the one hand, you want to protect innovation so creators can actually make a livelihood from doing their artwork or inventions or whatever the case is. But on the other hand, you don't want to at the same time shut down innovation of the next generation of innovators. And this is, I think, where copyright and patent law are running into some difficulties currently.
Do we know how that 75-year mark was chosen? Is it because that's roughly a human lifetime?
No, it's because of Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, it is. It is because of Mickey Mouse. It's all because of Disney.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to need more explanation. It's because of Mickey Mouse. It's not a clear explanation.
So journalism professor Jeff Jarvis has been talking about this for a while. As David was saying, copyright was supposed to promote originality. And the idea was that no one would engage in creativity or originality if they couldn't benefit primarily financially off of what they created. And so the idea was we would protect that for a limited period of time. And it was an extraordinarily limited period of time. Mm-hmm. The originator or the creator could benefit from that for that limited period of time, and then it would become public property. It would be in the public domain. Because of Mickey Mouse, the amount of time that creation was protected for kept getting extended, and every time the copyright of Mickey Mouse was going to end, Walt Disney and the company would lobby to extend it. And that's where we got to the life of the author plus 75 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so our copyright system is literally a Mickey Mouse system.
Clinky glasses and challenging ideas is kind of our thing here at Hotel Bar Sessions, but both the drinks and the server space cost money. You can help keep this podcast independent and ad-free by signing up to be a Hotel Bar Sessions patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. For less than the cost of a mild night of drinking per month, you'll be helping to defray the many costs of our podcast and saving us from having to start our own cult. If you'd prefer to make a one-time donation or several of them, just visit our website at hotelbarpodcast.com, where you can find links to support this podcast through Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App. As always, we appreciate your listening, and especially your helping us to keep pouring wisdom one conversation at a time.
Lee, in your introduction, you mentioned that we seem to be in a new age of the question of originality, particularly in academia. And I think that's true in one way, but I think we've always been concerned with originality in that almost every university has rules against plagiarism or an academic honesty policy. By the way, notice how that shows David's point about the values involved here, right? We call it academic honesty. Why? Because everyone wants to be honest, right? But we seem to be really obsessed with plagiarism. And now the retraction problem, where scholarly articles have been published in scientific journals, journals in the humanities, and so on, that then have to be retracted because they have been plagiarized. And I'm wondering, why are we so obsessed in the academic world with this issue of originality and then its opposite, plagiarism?
Yeah, I don't think that we're obsessed with originality. I think we're obsessed with punishing cheating. And I think it's a really terrible thing for a number of reasons. First of all, because I don't think we're doing a good job of explaining why, for example, all of the Byzantine protocols about citation and attribution, why they are the way that they are, what they're meant to do, how that contributes to the functioning of a healthy and collaborative intellectual community. I think we just tell students, make sure that you know the city that this book was published in and put it in the right place. Although I think they just recently took that away from citation protocols, but we're not really explaining why these protocols are so important. And then let's just be honest, a lot of the people who are running universities don't understand it themselves. And a lot of them aren't even academics. They just want to punish students for cheating. And that's not to say there aren't legit cheaters out there, but we've just focused so much on let's catch the cheaters that we've really missed the boat on even explaining why this is the way that it is. The other problem, and the much bigger problem, I think, is that we have an entire generation of students who live in a world in which these protocols just simply don't work anymore. It's very difficult for students to understand why we would place so much emphasis on who was the original author and when was the original publication date and why do they have to be cited, because there's so much uncited information out there. And that's not to say that a lot of it doesn't have an origin, but there's a lot of it that is collaborative. And just the understanding of how knowledge production works, I think, is dramatically different for Gen Z than it was for those of us brought up in the mid to late 20th century academic culture. So I think we're just really missing an opportunity to make some productive revisions here that would, in fact, re-emphasize the importance of collaborative knowledge production, creativity, and innovation in science and the humanities and the arts and ideas. Instead, what we've decided is we just want to be cheater police.
And it gets worse. Then we worry, do you put a period after the author's name? Is there a comma separating the volume and the issue? Does something go in parentheses?
Yeah, don't get me started on that.
Yeah, and none of that really matters. I always say to students, I just want to know what page of the text you're referring to. So just be clear where that happens, and that's enough for me.
Can I also just say one other thing, which is that I think it's absolutely ridiculous to expect of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that they have original thoughts. And that's not to say that they don't sometimes. But really, that's the time in your life when what you should be doing is learning how to understand this long intellectual tradition that we have, not just the ideas and the concepts and the proofs, but also the techniques and methods, understand how to use those. You know, you have the whole rest of your life to come up with something original. Right. It's just ridiculous to expect that this is the most important thing that we should be drawing out of people between the ages of 17 and 23.
There's an impossible position that someone is put in relation to this question of originality. And I mean both students, but also us as people who are publishing essays or books. Because on the one hand, if I were to write an essay and submit it for publication in an academic journal, and it was not thought to be original, it would be rejected, and the editors would say, this isn't an original contribution to the scholarship, so why should we be publishing it? And that's a good question, I think. On the other hand, if it is so original that it seems untied to what has been said before, then it's going to be rejected because it's either too radical or it appears to be nonsense or it's not related to the scholarly literature. And so there is really this impossible space. And I think we've all had a student who was really trying to be original and just produces nonsense.
We've had colleagues like that.
Well, and also colleagues. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So there's really this impossible position between originality and intelligibility.
So I'll just add two things. One is a little etymological point, because what we're talking about really is a crisis in authority and authorship.
Sure. Right.
And the ability to adequately provide the author with his or her authority over their content. And this goes back to the origin of the word plagiarism, because the word plagiarism derives from a Latin word meaning kidnapping. In the Phaedrus already, Socrates talks about the written word as being a bastard or orphan child,
right,
that once it is put into the world, it's out of the control of its parental authority. And so one of the problems we have, and the reason why plagiarism is so crucial at this point in time, is that we have so many ways of distributing information in various forms of media that are out of the control of the original author. And we're trying to create a structure by which to track everything back to the mind of the person who originated that idea. Mm-hmm. And what we're finding is this dissemination across networks of media where you cannot necessarily track it back to an original author or an authority. So this gets us into Barth's Death of the Author, right?
Yeah.
This idea that you now have the text or the media that can be read and utilized and recombined and transformed without the control of the author being able to be exercised over that material. And I think instead of making it a binary opposition where it's either original or plagiarized, we've got to come up with a way in higher ed to educate our students in the best practices of plagiarism, in quotation marks, because they're all involved in it. We're all quoting. Emerson already says this. There is no originality. All minds quote.
Yeah.
So if we're constantly quoting, if we're sampling everything that's come before, if we're all DJs laying down a track and adding a new track on top of it, eventually something evolves out of that may be kind of original. But how do we credit our source material? I think one of the problems we have in academia is that we have a credit system for source material that is antiquated.
Right.
And that doesn't quite scale to not only the situation of the 21st century, but the media of the 21st century. Mm. Like, we didn't even know how to cite Wikipedia, so we just said don't.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So once we figure out a way to cite it, then it's perfectly fine. We need to update all of these antiquated ways of doing things because it's inhibiting innovation. It isn't saving innovation from copying. It's making innovation difficult because students are now reticent to even try some things because they're afraid it will be plagiarism.
That's so true. I mean, there really is a fear culture around this. And I think we all probably were in grad school or coming up in the profession around the same time. The death of the author was a big deal.
Yeah.
I think we were all kind of like celebrating it.
Yeah.
It offered a lot of new pathways forward for thinking about collaborative knowledge production. But man, has it been the case in, say, the last 10, 20 years that we're trying to resuscitate that dead corpse of the author, like Jeremy Bentham, like put it right back in the same seat that it was when it died.
Right.
So the other figure here is Foucault in his essay, What is an Author?, where he points out that the notion of the author is about penal appropriation.
Exactly.
It's about something to punish. So the reason why you have authors and the reason why you have the vested interest of the author invoked is to figure out how you punish people. And that's kind of what we're doing with plagiarism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree with everything that you just said, David, but I also think that it is worthwhile for us to spend more time emphasizing to students the value of collaborative work, collaborative thought, collaborative creation, and not necessarily the value of originality. I personally would be fine with having 95% of my students graduate and just be really good cover bands.
Right.
They appreciate good original content and they've got the skills to put a little bit of their own twist on it, but they understand that they're carrying forward a tradition and maybe a few of them are originals. Only a few times in our life we do something that's really original, that's worth covering, right? But for the most part, as a society, that's what we need to be imparting to our students moving forward, I think.
I think that's really importantly. And, I actually think that most of what I do philosophically is cover band. And it took me a long time in my career to understand that's fantastic. That is a contribution and maybe even, dare I say, an original contribution. And that there are other ways of doing philosophy. And I have many colleagues who I would say are much more original or creative than I am. And I used to be jealous of that. but I no longer am, because I think my covering the greatest hits of the history of philosophy is an important and interesting contribution.
Yeah.
I just want to add another metaphor to our mix of metaphors here. I think the cover band metaphor is good, but I also think the DJ metaphor is a good item to mobilize here, because I think we can also look at the work we do as being a DJ. And I often look at what I do as being a DJ. I do a lot of crate diving, finding samples hidden in the history of philosophy that people have forgotten about. And then I recontextualize them and transform them in the process of working with other samples. And I think if we were trying to train students to be better DJs, to be involved in this curation of the tradition, not breaking with the tradition as much as reinvigorating the tradition for a new time by recontextualizing it, by decontextualizing it, by transforming it. We are engaged in sampling what came before. And the selections we make, what we decide to sample and how we decide to integrate it, is as crucial to our own process as it is to what DJs do on the dance floor. And I think if we look at ourselves less as authors and more as DJs, we get a better appreciation for the manner by which this work is conducted.
I love the way of saying that. Yeah. Remixes.
I love the DJ metaphor. That also, to go back to something Lee said, can be a collaborative enterprise. To give an example, I write frequently with a friend of mine, Christopher Long, former guest of the podcast. And up until now, we have been writing under our names, Christopher Long and Richard Lee. But we have decided now to write under a pseudonym because we produce something together that neither one of us could produce separately. What is produced is neither mine nor his, nor each of us as an individual together, but it's a production of something that is neither one of us. And so we are DJing, as you say, the history of philosophy, but we're also doing that collaboratively. I'll pull out a sample and he would be like, oh, wait, you know what? That's connected to this other sample. You know, it has this same line in it, or the beat is the same. And this goes back to Lee's point about collaboration, that I don't think we emphasize collaboration enough.
I love this. I'm just thinking like how much time it would save when you're, citing various thinkers from the Enlightenment who are all basically saying the same thing. How much easier it would be just to cite Enlightenment thinker.
You could call it Enlightenment Inc.
Yeah, right.
We love that you join us here at the Hotel Bar for our boozy, brain-powered podcast. But we get a little tired of talking amongst ourselves here in a virtual bar. So if you'd like to pull up a stool beside us, and also beside other listeners in our Hotel Bar Sessions community, then follow us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast. There you can also find the Twitter handles of all three of us co-hosts. For our more senior listeners, we're also on Facebook. All of our episodes are on YouTube, and from time to time, we, that is Lee, by the way, even make an appearance on TikTok. By the way, you could go old school and email us at any time at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our interactive page at hotelbarpodcast.com if you have any feedback or you have ideas for episodes or to rant at us or rave about us. We have a designated reader for those messages who is mostly only a little tipsy. Who knows, your suggestion could help keep intellectual insights on tap and on the air.
Well, guys, speaking of academia, it's been about 2 years now since we had the great ChatGPT crisis. As you remember, it was only 2 falls ago, I think, that every single headline and every single newspaper was saying, how are we going to have college anymore? Because now there's ChatGPT. And I don't know how you would evaluate our current situation, but it seems like we're still chugging along. Nothing collapsed because of ChatGPT, but it is a problem. I don't know. I don't want to say it's a problem, but it is a challenge in higher education right now. I think what people out there in the world, a lot of people don't know, is that ChatGPT is, of course, just one of many iterations of generative AI. It's the one that causes probably the most problem for higher education, but we've got image generators and music generators, and it's getting harder, I think, for people to say what is original content, and we don't really know what to do with the, and I'm going to put it in scare quotes, originality of content that's produced by machine intelligences. So a few seasons ago, when David was a guest on our podcast talking about robots, I remember asking you at the end of that episode, what do you think is the next thing coming that we need to worry about? And you said, I think we're going to have to worry about AI productions and whether or not we're going to consider them original. And you specifically mentioned music and art. So I'm kind of wondering now where you are sitting on that question today.
Yeah, no, I was prescient for one second. That's kind of nice.
I dare say original.
Yes, I dare say. I am really stoked about what's going on with generative AI.
Same.
I think it's absolutely insane and interesting and lots of good material there for thinking with and through, but also a lot of challenges. If we confront it trying to reassert the usual way of doing things, we may find ourselves struggling against a brick wall or trying to swim upstream. I think a number of things need to be thought about here. Generative AI is similar to remix, but it's also different from remix because generative AI does not work with samples. So in remix, the unit of analysis, the fundamental unit of analysis is the sample. In generative AI, there is no sample. You train the large language model on every conceivable text ever published in digital form on the internet. Then the algorithm finds statistically valid patterns in the arrangement of words that it can utilize in responding to a prompt. So in effect, it is producing absolutely brand new sequences of words that have not been lifted verbatim or plagiarized from any particular place. Nevertheless, it is based on all of this human text that has been generated over the last 2,000 plus years and is basically deriving its own output from the patterns that it discovers in this large data set. So it raises a number of interesting questions because what we get with a large language model is really an interruption of the logocentric tradition, that writing is derivative of speech, this idea of the author as wanting to say something, having an intention. An expression, a pushing out of their ideas. The large language model does not express itself. The large language model has no thought. The large language model isn't intending to say anything, and yet it produces text. We get writing without there being an author. We get writing without there being an intention to say anything. So if you look at something from ChatGPT and your question is, what does the algorithm want to say? That's the wrong question. It doesn't want to say anything. But what is there is something that we are able as readers to extract meaning out of, because statistically, the words are in the right sequence and it makes sense to us. I think it's a really interesting moment in time when 2,000 years of Western philosophy is sort of running headlong into an inversion of the usual way of thinking about things.
But to play the deconstructive card, I think also what's happening is a recognition that we are not as intentional as we originally thought. Intentionality is itself much more machine-like than we have been admitting. And maybe this 2,000 years of the history of philosophy has been an attempt to say, pay no attention to the machine behind the curtain. It's all completely free, original intentionality. I think there's lots of good reasons to think that my intentionality is not, first of all, mine, and it's not intentional in the ways we normally mean it. This is an argument that you don't need deconstruction for. You could go back to the appendix to part 1 of Spinoza's Ethics, where he's basically arguing that the reason why we think we have this creativity and this intentionality is because we just aren't aware of the various ways in which we're determined. That makes us uncomfortable. And so we now say, yeah, but we do something different than the generative AI.
Even if you want to still hold on to, as I imagine probably in our heart of hearts, all of us want to hold on to, this idea that there is something free and expressive and intentional in human creativity and human knowledge production, it's still the case that we have to admit that how we learn to speak, how we learn to express ourselves is very similar to what these large language models do. We've learned predictive patterns of sequences of linking words together, linking sounds together, linking symbols together, and eventually linking ideas together. That's how we express ourselves. And so I think David's absolutely right. It is the wrong question to ask, what did ChatGPT mean, or what is it trying to say? But it is not, I think, right to say that whatever it produces is not original, in a way very similar to the things that we call original when we talk about human artistic production or musical production or language production. So I suppose the real question that I wanted to get at here was, are we going to have to start attributing originality to generative AI productions in the same way that we do to human productions?
This is a question that right now is being tested not only in academic circles, but actually in legal practice.
Yeah.
So currently, you cannot assign a artificial intelligence device or application copyright and intellectual property as an author. There's been a number of recent court cases that said that this work produced by the algorithm is without an author. Mm-hmm. Which sounds like a solution, but it's really quite bad for us because then we don't know how to attribute anything to it. We don't know how to cite it, and we don't know who owns it or how it can be used or misused, as the case may be. There is a lawyer by the name of Ryan Abbott who is going around the world to different intellectual property offices, in this case, offices that do patents. And he's trying to get a patent given to an AI called Dabus that has invented a food storage system, kind of like Tupperware. In the US and the UK, the filing of the patent on behalf of Dabus has been denied. And the reason why it's been denied is that the statutes that are being applied, the patent statutes, say that you must be a natural-born person, a human being, to be an author or an inventor. In other places in the world, in South Africa and Australia, he's been successful because the statute doesn't have that stipulation. It doesn't require there to be a human living person as the inventor or as the author. So I think what's happening is we're seeing the rules that we've written for ourselves to make sense of our entire axiological system with originality and plagiarism and copying and all this sort of stuff. This is all up for grabs.
Yeah.
And I think it is generative AI that's causing us to say, not only do we have to answer the question for the generative AI system, but maybe we have to look back at ourselves and look at the rules that we've written and see what they protect, what axiologies they enable, and whether or not they need to be revised.
Yeah, just going back to the classroom for a second, I mean, it is a little bit hard to explain how copying something from ChatGPT is plagiarism. I'm not saying that my moral instincts are not telling me that it is, but it's hard to explain how it is.
Well, I would go back to a word you've used a couple of times, Lee, namely cheating. And I would agree that something like plagiarism is cheating. I would just disagree on who or what is being cheated. I think that the punitive measures surrounding plagiarism assume that either I as the instructor or we as the institution or the scientific community have been cheated by this act. But I think the one who's been cheated is the one who's copying, right?
Of course, yeah.
It's better not to cheat yourself than to cheat yourself. Therefore, you shouldn't copy from ChatGPT as much as you shouldn't copy from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was the Wikipedia of my day.
Right. I'm just saying that extrapolating, though, is there any other manner in which we punish students for cheating themselves?
No.
We have all kinds of students that don't live up to their potential.
Exactly.
Like, we don't punish
I was
them for
one.
that. Yeah.
So when you're learning music, you learn to play various pieces, like a piece by Bach or Beethoven. And you sit down at the piano and you play the notes on the piano and you learn to reproduce their composition.
Yeah.
This is sort of a Borges remix of this with regards to ChatGPT. So if the student just cuts and pastes the output of the algorithm into their exam format or into their paper, I think we'd say that's cheating. Mm-hmm. But what if the student copied word for word what's on the screen and wrote it themselves by hand in a blue book? Mm-hmm. This would kind of be like the Pierre Menard verbatim copying, and the process of the copying might itself be an act of originality, or it might be a process of learning, the same way that we learn when we play Beethoven.
Yeah.
This I don't know how to answer. But I think it's an interesting question.
Well, I think what you're pointing to are the ways in which interacting with ChatGPT can be a learning experience. And I've used it several times with my students to say, ask it the same question that I've asked you for this short essay, see what it puts out, and let's edit it. That is learn. I mean, you learn something in the process of correcting it and putting it, as we would say, in your original voice. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a tough situation that we're in right now because I unfortunately think that the folks that are making the rules don't really understand the tech well enough, and that there's not a lot of effort on the part of higher education. I mean, and that's not to say there's no effort. There are a lot of people who are really excited about these new tools, but there's not a lot of effort or concentrated effort to say, this is an amazing new education innovation. Let's use it as a tool and stop the scare campaign about it.
2 points come up that are important to dwell on for 1 second. One is, Lee, you used the phrase your original voice. And if my original voice could be identified as mine, then that means that there's a pattern to it, that in a way it is already algorithmic. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, in me using my original voice, am I being original? That is, there's a way in which I'm copying myself constantly to the extent that I have a voice that is identifiable and so on. The other issue is that the actual creativity might not be in the creation, so in the example we're using, in the writing, but actually in the editing. As I say to my students, writing is easy. Like, you could sit down and write 15 pages right now. Editing is hard. Mm-hmm. And I think the creativity comes in the editing rather than in the writing, and I think that in worrying about ChatGPT, we forget that.
Yeah.
Now, I think we forget it because our students never or rarely give themselves enough time to edit what they've written. And so we read a lot of unedited material. And we're probably going to be reading a lot of unedited ChatGPT material. But that doesn't make the point a lie that it's the editing that is, if not more creative, at least equally as creative as the spewing out of content.
I also just want to say for the record that, of course, students cheating in college is not the biggest threat of these new large language models. I mean, the biggest threat is the production of fake news and the rapid repetition of those sorts of things that we already see happening. I mean, I think everyone knows that most of the work that, not most, but a lot of the work that used to be done by journalists is now just being done by large language models. You're just getting a lot of pro forma, pat content out there that's meant to be news. And unfortunately, it makes mistakes. And the more those mistakes are repeated, the more that information is out there. And the training model is learning that information. And it's becoming a part of how it understands how language works. That is worrisome because the model doesn't care the difference between true and false. Right. It just cares how the sentences are put together and how often they are put together that way. So that is important to remember. But I do want to just for a second, if we could, talk about what I think is a much bigger threat, which is the image and audio generation AIs, because, this is where we get deep fakes. This is where we get revenge porn. I remember, I guess it was a couple of years ago, there was this new kind of phone scam where people were deep faking other people's voices. And then I think the way that it worked was that somebody would call you up that you knew, and they would say, I'm in Mexico and I got arrested and send this money, So, I think that those are things that we really should worry about. And I am particularly worried about them in the upcoming months. This is what we don't need in the upcoming months leading up to a very important presidential election, is for someone to make a video, to make a recording that is entirely AI generated, and that will just be repeated and repeated and repeated. And we'll just lose all confidence in not only what we read, but also what our eyes and ears tell us.
And frankly, Lee, if I called you and said, I'm in Mexico and I got drunk and lost my money, can you send me money? You'd be like, again?
This checks out.
Right.
But I think what you bring up is important because it really gets to something I think we're going to talk about later in the season when we get to Baudrillard's simulations.
Yeah.
This notion that we take media representations as a faithful reproduction of a reality. We've been doing that since photography, since the invention of sound recording. But these are rather recent innovations in technology. For a long time, people said, I don't trust things that are written down. I don't trust things on the radio. But we learned to trust them over time. And now I think we're unlearning how to trust them, right? We're being more skeptical. So what we've got to do in response to this is recognize that we are being challenged to confront, once again, our own metaphysical apparatus for making sense of representations and reproductions and the way that we assume that they are representing to us something that is really real.
Yeah.
And as a result of all that, I think Baudrillard provides us, through his work on simulation, a way to think about a reality that is entirely manufactured. And the real task for us as educators is to create a critical mindset in our graduates that are able to respond not naively to the proliferation of these kinds of images and these kinds of deep fakes in a way that can help them navigate a situation where the way that we used to think about things in the early 20th century no longer applies in the early 21st century.
Exactly.
Well, and for something like a deep fake, I imagine all of us could come up with examples in which we would say that that's incredibly creative and, it's a positive thing and so on. Yep. And then on the other hand, when robocalls that purport to be from Joe Biden are going around saying, hey, save your vote for the general election, sit out the primary this season, which was a fake, that's a problem. But is the issue there that we have the ability to punk one another, or is the problem that we do punk one another? And then I ask the question, isn't it thus has it ever been? And I'm not sure then where exactly the problem lies.
But then the solution is really easy, right? We just have to morally educate all of our citizens.
Or we have to stop being naive realists.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have to stop thinking that there's a reality that exists for all times in its pristine originality. It doesn't. We manufacture it over and over again. And the devices by which we manufacture it and the mediums by which we manufacture it and the technologies by which we do so, that's all changing. But it doesn't change the fact that we've manufactured it.
Yes.
Yeah, when I teach Aristotle's Poetics, there he talks about art being mimesis, which is frequently translated as imitation. And I often show to students a Picasso painting that I think the title in English is Lady in an Armchair. It's a cubist painting. So like one eye is where the knee should be and, an ear is where the stomach should be and so on. I say, okay, this is an imitation of a reality. And what the imitation does is it might actually bring forward some kind of truth that I haven't ever seen before.
Right.
And so the imitation might in some cases be more preferable to the reality. And to go back to Enlightenment Inc., I think that moving us out of myth made us all naive realists, that we no longer engage the world in terms of storytelling, right? And I don't know if it's ever the case that people really thought Zeus was a thing, but it is a story that I think helps account for reality and is not a naive, realistic account.
So this has been a really great conversation, you guys, but unfortunately our bartender is issuing us a last call. She says that she has heard it all before from us. So I'm going to ask you guys if you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with. We'll go to you first, Rick. Original thoughts only.
I mean, one thought I would like to leave with is, if you discovered that everything that was said in this conversation was generated by ChatGPT, does that make it less valuable?
I would completely agree with that. I find that to be a really nice hook for thinking about all of this. I would just add that as educators, we teach our students nothing when we prohibit things. When we say thou shalt not, they learn nothing. And if they're going to live in a world with ChatGPT, with diffusion models, with all of these technologies, we have got to engage them in using it and learning its opportunities and its challenges so they can become critical users and not just dependent users at the disposal of the tool as opposed to them being in control of how it's used.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on what David is saying there. I think in training them to use these tools in, let's say it, original ways, I think it's also really important for us to keep reinforcing that knowledge production, artistic productions, cultural productions are always collaborative efforts. We need to start thinking about these as collaborative products and not in the way that we're trained by late stage capitalism as pieces of property that we're either going to profit off of or that are going to be stolen from us. So I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's been really helpful. And I am 100% going to be just referring to Enlightenment Inc. for the rest of my career.
And by the way, if any of you copy this podcast and publish it under your own name, we're going to sue the shit out of you.
That's right. We have lawyers and we're ready to lawyer up.
I know Mickey Mouse personally. All right, guys, I'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Later.